If I'm wrong, you'll lose 5 minutes. If I'm right, you'll lose the entire country. Jordan Brooks's voice cut through the secure conference room with the sharp clarity of a fire alarm, yet the only response was silence followed by a ripple of restrained laughter around the polished walnut table. The digital wall clock above the classified operations display read 7:52 a.m. Inside the Pentagon's Defense Cyber Operations Center in Arlington, Virginia, every second carried the weight of national security. But no one looked at the countdown Jordan could see racing through his own mind. At 24 years old, dressed in a Navy government contractor badge clipped to a simple charcoal sweater instead of the decorated uniform surrounding him, he looked more like a graduate student than the cybersecurity analyst who had spent the previous 43 minutes tracing an invisible intrusion buried beneath millions of lines of encrypted network traffic. His laptop still displayed the anomaly, a sequence of harmless-looking authentication requests repeating with mechanical precision, each one too perfect to belong to a human operator. Jordan swallowed once before taking another step toward the massive display wall. "Sir, the malware isn't attacking yet," he said, forcing himself to remain calm. "It's waiting. Whoever built this wants us to believe everything is normal until they decide otherwise." General Richard Hale slowly leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands across the polished conference table. His silver hair reflected the cool white lighting overhead as he studied the young analyst with the patient expression of someone entertaining an interruption rather than evaluating a warning. "Mr. Brooks," he replied evenly, "this meeting is reserved for senior personnel." Jordan didn't move. "I understand, General. That's exactly why I came here instead of filing another ticket." Deputy Director Stephen Collins glanced towards several intelligence officials seated along the far side of the room before smirking. "You bypassed protocol because your computer told you a ghost story?" A few quiet chuckles spread through the room. Jordan ignored them. He connected his laptop to the presentation system with trembling but steady hands. Within seconds, lines of encrypted traffic appeared across the giant display. Tiny green indicators pulsed in perfect synchronization before vanishing into the background like stars disappearing at sunrise. "Look here," Jordan said, pointing toward a sequence almost impossible to notice without magnification. "Every 71 seconds, this hidden process validates administrator trust across multiple defense networks. That's not maintenance traffic. It's building persistence." Colonel Mark Benson folded his arms. "Our monitoring systems haven't reported a breach because the code is impersonating the monitoring systems," Jordan answered immediately. "It's hiding inside the trust architecture." The room fell quiet for barely a heartbeat before Collins laughed outright. "You expect everyone here to believe that every automated defense platform somehow missed what you discovered before breakfast?" Jordan met his eyes without raising his voice. "No, sir. I expect you to verify it before someone else activates it." Collins stood. "Enough." The word echoed across the room with practiced authority. "You're a temporary contractor. You don't interrupt classified briefings with theories you can't prove." Jordan inhaled slowly, fighting the pressure building behind his ribs. "I can prove it if you disconnect the primary command cluster for 3 minutes." General Hale's expression hardened. "Disconnect national defense systems because you have a feeling?" "Not a feeling, sir." Jordan's voice remained remarkably steady. A countdown. Several executives exchanged impatient looks. Someone quietly closed a notebook. Another reached for a coffee cup as though the discussion had already ended. Collins stepped toward Jordan and extended his hand. "Your access badge." Jordan blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Please, just isolate the network." "Badge." Jordan looked once more at the enormous wall of glowing displays. Thousands of status indicators shimmered across the command center in organized patterns of green and blue. To everyone else, they represented stability. To him, they resembled a city whose lights remained on moments before an approaching storm. He slowly unclipped the government badge from his sweater and placed it into Collins' waiting hand. "You'll regret wasting time," Jordan said quietly. Collins slipped the badge into his jacket pocket without hesitation. "Security will escort you outside." Two uniformed officers approached with professional courtesy rather than hostility. Jordan closed his laptop, holding it tightly against his chest as he walked toward the heavy security doors. No one attempted to stop him. No one asked another question. Behind him, the briefing resumed almost immediately, conversations blending with the soft hum of climate systems and the distant clicking of keyboards. As the reinforced doors sealed shut behind him, Jordan paused in the long marble corridor. Through the narrow glass panel beside the entrance, he caught one final glimpse of the glowing command screens inside. Then his smartwatch vibrated once. The countdown reached exactly 8 o'clock. Jordan Brooks stepped through the final security gate and into the cool morning air just as the first rays of sunlight reflected across the pale limestone walls of the Pentagon. The breeze carried the distant sound of traffic moving along Interstate 395, completely ordinary, almost peaceful, as if the world had no idea that something invisible had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He stood quietly on the wide concrete plaza, his laptop tucked beneath one arm, while the empty space where his government badge had rested suddenly felt heavier than the computer itself. His smartwatch displayed 8 o'clock exactly. Jordan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not because he had given up, but because there was nothing more he was allowed to do. That feeling was painfully familiar. Growing up in Baltimore, Maryland, Jordan had learned early that being the smartest person in the room did not always make people listen. His mother, Angela Brooks, had spent 30 years teaching mathematics at Frederick Douglass High School. Every evening she reminded him that knowledge earned respect only after patience survived rejection. His father, Marcus Brooks, worked overnight shifts as a registered nurse, often returning. Their apartment had never been large, but every shelf seemed filled with old computers, rescued from recycling centers, their cases scratched and faded, waiting for Jordan to breathe new life into them. At 12 years old, he had rebuilt his first server from discarded parts. At 15, he had won a statewide cybersecurity competition after identifying vulnerabilities that experienced professionals overlooked. At 17, he quietly helped a regional hospital recover from a ransomware attack during a volunteer internship, refusing every television interview because he believed the patients deserved attention more than he did. His professors at Johns Hopkins University often joked that Jordan could read computer code the way musicians read sheet music. Patterns that looked ordinary to everyone else appeared painfully obvious to him, almost as if malicious software left fingerprints only he could see. Yet none of those accomplishments changed the first impression many people formed when they met him. He was young. He was quiet. He spoke carefully instead of loudly. More than once, clients had mistaken him for an intern before discovering he was leading the technical assessment. Jordan never argued. He simply let his work speak. That habit had earned him a short-term government contract, supporting the Defense Cyber Operations Center only 6 months earlier. The assignment was considered prestigious, but he treated it like every other responsibility. He arrived before sunrise, reviewed overnight network logs while most offices remained dark, and left long after the evening cleaning crews began their rounds. The security guards knew him well enough to greet him by name because they often saw him carrying coffee into the building before anyone else arrived. He smiled at everyone, remembered birthdays, and thanked the custodial staff when they emptied the recycling bins beside his workstation. Recognition had never interested him. Solving problems did. That was why the discovery 2 nights earlier had unsettled him so deeply. What began as a tiny inconsistency inside authentication records slowly unfolded into something almost impossible to believe. Someone had built malicious code capable of hiding inside the very systems responsible for detecting cyber threats. Every layer of protection quietly trusted the next layer, creating a perfect illusion that everything remained secure. Jordan had checked his calculations once, then twice, then 21 separate times across 2 sleepless nights. Every result pointed to the same conclusion. The malicious process was waiting for a specific command that could arrive at any moment. He had documented every finding, submitted formal reports, requested emergency review, and even attached detailed technical evidence. Each submission disappeared into administrative queues without response. Walking into the classified briefing had been his final option, not his first impulse. Now, standing outside without authorization to re-enter, Jordan looked back toward the enormous building stretching across the horizon. Thousands of people continued working inside, completely unaware that the clock he had been watching for hours had finally reached the moment he feared most. His smartwatch vibrated again, but this time it was not a countdown. It was a single system notification that should have been impossible to receive after his access had been revoked. It contained only 3 words: connection permanently lost. Jordan stared at the impossible notification for several long seconds before the message disappeared from his smartwatch as quietly as it had arrived. Connection permanently lost. There was no sender, no timestamp, and no classified channel that should have remained active after his credentials had been revoked. He tapped the screen once, then again. Nothing. The display returned to its ordinary home screen, as if the warning had never existed. A cold certainty settled over him. Whatever had entered the network had just completed another stage. Inside the Pentagon, however, the atmosphere remained almost untouched by urgency. General Richard Hale resumed the classified briefing, with the confidence of a man who had spent more than 3 decades trusting disciplined procedures over instinct. The massive operations center glowed beneath rows of suspended monitors, each displaying reassuring green indicators besides satellite communications, encrypted defense links, and strategic command systems. Deputy Director Stephen Collins adjusted his tie and looked around the room with a satisfied smile. Now that we can continue without unnecessary interruptions, let us focus on today's readiness assessment. Several senior officials nodded while assistants resumed typing meeting notes across secure government laptops. Colonel Mark Benson stepped toward the main digital display and highlighted the latest cybersecurity readiness report. No verified intrusions, no operational disruptions, no evidence of hostile persistence inside critical infrastructure. His laser pointer moved confidently across colorful charts summarizing network integrity percentages that exceeded 99%. A senior intelligence advisor leaned back in his chair. Exactly what we expected, another official added. The monitoring architecture has never been stronger. Collins folded his arms. This is precisely why protocols exist. Technical staff analyze data. Leadership evaluates facts. We cannot afford emotional decision-making every time someone believes they have found a hidden threat. Several people around the table quietly agreed. One analyst cautiously cleared her throat. Sir, should we at least review the contractor's evidence before closing the incident? Collins barely looked in her direction. The issue has already been reviewed. His conclusions were unsupported. General Hale closed the discussion with a calm nod. We move forward. Outside, Jordan slowly lowered himself onto a wide stone bench overlooking the south parking area. Government employees crossed the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, greeting one another with ordinary Monday morning conversations. None of them noticed the young cybersecurity analyst sitting alone with a laptop that contained evidence no one inside had chosen to examine. He opened the computer once more, even though it no longer connected to classified systems. The local analysis files remained intact. Layer after layer of encrypted logs confirmed exactly what he had reported. Hidden authentication requests, delayed execution routines, privilege escalation, concealed beneath legitimate security certificates. Every technical indicator pointed toward the same conclusion. The malicious code had never intended to break into the system. It had convinced the system to invite it inside. Jordan whispered to himself, "Please let me be wrong." The words disappeared into the quiet morning breeze. Across the Potomac River, sunlight reflected from office windows in Washington District of Columbia, making the skyline appear almost peaceful beneath the clear summer sky. A passenger jet crossed high overhead, leaving a thin white trail that slowly dissolved into blue. Everything looked normal. That was the most frightening part. Jordan remembered something his mother had once told him after a mathematics competition where judges initially overlooked one of his correct solutions. Truth does not become false, because important people refuse to see it. He had smiled then. Today those words felt painfully heavy. Inside the operations center, an engineer frowned at one of the monitoring displays. A small status icon had briefly flickered from green to gray before immediately returning to normal. Probably a refresh delay, he muttered while clicking through diagnostic menus. Another monitor paused for less than a second before updating normally again. No alarm sounded, no warning lights flashed. The room continued discussing budgets, readiness exercises, and deployment schedules. Collins glanced at the wall clock. 8 minutes had passed since Jordan walked out. As I was saying, he continued confidently, Our greatest cybersecurity strength remains discipline. At that exact moment, deep inside, thousands of interconnected servers scattered across secured facilities, a hidden sequence quietly reached its final instruction and began executing without a single audible sound. The first sound was not an alarm. It was silence. One by one, conversations inside the operations center slowed as monitors that had glowed steadily only seconds earlier began freezing in place. A satellite tracking display stopped refreshing. An encrypted communications dashboard locked on the same timestamp. A logistics map failed to update moving aircraft positions. Then, without warning, every screen across the front wall faded to black at exactly the same moment. The quiet lasted less than 2 seconds before dozens of warning tones erupted from backup consoles throughout the room. Red indicator lights replaced the familiar green glow that had filled the operations center only moments before. An engineer stared at his keyboard and pressed the same command 3 times. Nothing happened. Another analyst attempted to reconnect to the secure monitoring network. The authentication request never returned. Colonel Mark Benson stepped toward the nearest console with growing disbelief. Report. A systems engineer swallowed hard before answering. Primary command interface is not responding, sir. Another voice came from the communications section. Encrypted links are unavailable. A third analyst looked up from her terminal. The backup environment is refusing authentication. Deputy Director Stephen Collins walked quickly across the room, his confidence dissolving with every unanswered command. Restart the management servers. Already attempted, sir. Switch to the disaster recovery cluster. It is offline too. General Richard Hale remained standing at the head of the conference table, his eyes fixed on the wall of dark displays reflecting only the pale ceiling lights above them. For the first time that morning, nobody spoke about protocols or readiness reports. The room had transformed from absolute confidence into controlled confusion in less than 30 seconds. Collins grabbed the nearest secure phone. The line remained silent. He picked up another handset connected to an independent circuit. No signal. This cannot all fail simultaneously, he muttered. A senior network architect answered quietly. It should not be possible. General Hale turned sharply. What exactly are we looking at? The architect hesitated before speaking. Someone appears to have compromised the trust layer itself. Every protected system believes the attack is legitimate. The words hung in the room with unbearable weight because every person present remembered hearing almost the exact same explanation less than 10 minutes earlier. No one laughed now. Several officials exchanged uneasy glances without saying a word. Collins slowly looked toward the empty chair where Jordan Brooks had stood with his laptop only minutes before. He remembered the young analyst pointing to hidden authentication requests. He remembered dismissing them as theory. He remembered taking the access badge from his sweater. Outside, Jordan remained seated on the stone bench, studying the local copies of his analysis files. He noticed a flock of birds suddenly lifting into the bright Virginia sky as emergency vehicles quietly accelerated toward restricted entrances surrounding the Pentagon. Security officers began speaking urgently into portable radios while employees entering the building were redirected toward temporary holding areas. Jordan looked up. Something had changed. He could not hear the alarms inside, but he recognized the pattern of movement immediately. Experienced security personnel never ran without reason. His phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Jordan answered without hesitation. Jordan Brooks speaking. The voice on the other end was tense, controlled, and instantly recognizable. This is General Richard Hale. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence carried more weight than any apology could have. Finally, the general took a slow breath. Mr. Brooks, I need you to answer one question. Jordan stood slowly from the bench, his eyes remaining fixed on the massive building in front of him. Yes, sir. Is this what you tried to warn us about? Jordan closed his eyes for only a moment before replying with quiet honesty. No, sir. Hale's heartbeat seemed to stop. What do you mean? Jordan looked toward the dark windows reflecting the morning sun. This is only the beginning. The activation phase has started. If we do not isolate the infected trust architecture within the next 15 minutes, every connected defense network that still trusts those certificates will begin shutting itself down exactly as it was designed to do. General Richard Hale tightened his grip on the secure phone until his knuckles turned pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Around him, the operations center no longer resembled the calm command room that had dismissed Jordan Brooks only minutes before. Engineers moved rapidly between silent workstations. Technical specialists compared handwritten notes because secure messaging had stopped responding, and every face carried the same expression that only appeared when certainty vanished without warning. Hale lowered his voice. "Mr. Brooks, tell me exactly what we need to do." Jordan remained standing outside beneath the bright Virginia morning sky, watching emergency vehicles quietly reposition around the building. His voice stayed steady despite everything that had happened. The infected trust certificates must be isolated before the automated synchronization cycle completes. Collins stepped beside the general and spoke loudly enough for Jordan to hear through the speaker. "Can you walk our team through it?" Jordan hesitated for only a second. "No, sir." Collins frowned. "Why not?" "Because your team cannot see the infected layer anymore. The malware is controlling the authentication process itself. Every instruction they receive from the system is being filtered." Silence settled across the room again. Several senior engineers slowly lowered their eyes because they knew he was right. One of them finally spoke. "General, he warned us about exactly this." Another analyst added quietly, "Every diagnostic tool now reports healthy systems because the compromised trust architecture is generating false confirmations." Collins looked from one specialist to another, hoping someone would disagree. Nobody did. General Hale took a slow breath before asking the question he never imagined he would have to ask. "Can you still stop it?" Jordan answered immediately. "Yes, sir." Hope briefly returned to several exhausted faces inside the room. Then Jordan continued, "But I cannot do it from outside the building." Hale turned toward the nearest security officer. "Restore his credentials immediately." The officer looked uncomfortable. "Sir, his badge was permanently disabled after the removal order." Collins closed his eyes for a moment. The consequences of his own decision suddenly became painfully real. "Issue temporary access." "That requires network authorization, sir, and the authorization servers are offline." The room fell silent once more. The irony was impossible to ignore. The system they had trusted to remove Jordan now prevented them from bringing him back. Hale wasted no more time. "Prepare a physical escort. I will authorize entry myself." Outside, Jordan slipped his laptop back into its case as another government vehicle approached the security perimeter. He noticed employees gathering in small groups, quietly exchanging confused conversations while looking toward the unusually dark windows of the operations center. Rumors had already begun spreading, but nobody outside knew the truth. A young security officer hurried toward Jordan with visible urgency. Unlike earlier that morning, there was no suspicion in his eyes, only respect mixed with concern. "Mr. Brooks?" Jordan nodded. "The general requests that you return immediately." Jordan looked at the officer for a brief moment before asking calmly, "Has anyone isolated the external synchronization gateways?" The officer blinked. "Sir, I do not know." Jordan gave a faint, thoughtful nod. "Then we still have time." They walked quickly toward the nearest security entrance. As Jordan approached the checkpoint where his badge had been confiscated less than 15 minutes earlier, the same guards who had escorted him outside stepped aside without saying a word. One of them quietly opened the reinforced door by hand, because the electronic access controls were no longer functioning. Jordan thanked him with the same calm politeness he had shown earlier that morning. The guard lowered his eyes, clearly remembering the uncomfortable escort that had taken place only minutes before. Inside the long marble corridor, emergency lighting had replaced portions of the normal illumination, casting soft amber reflections across the polished floor. The familiar hallway suddenly felt different, not because the building had changed, but because everyone inside now understood something they had refused to believe. As Jordan walked toward the operations center carrying nothing except his laptop, conversations stopped one after another. Analysts looked up from printed reports. Military officers stepped aside to clear the hallway. Contractors who had barely noticed him before now watched him pass with quiet disbelief. No one smiled. No one whispered. No one questioned why the youngest person in the building had become the one everyone was waiting for. Ahead, the heavy security doors slowly opened. revealing an operations center still illuminated by dark screens that reflected the faces of the very people who had laughed only minutes earlier. Jordan Brooks stepped into the operations center without changing his pace, and for the first time that morning, no one questioned why he was there. The room that had greeted him with quiet laughter less than half an hour earlier now stood frozen beneath rows of dark displays, reflecting worried faces instead of glowing data. The constant background hum of keyboards and routine conversations had disappeared, replaced by the soft whir of emergency ventilation systems and the occasional beep from isolated backup equipment struggling to remain online. General Richard Hale walked directly toward him and stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Then the general extended his hand. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Jordan looked at the offered hand before shaking it politely. "We can discuss that later, sir." His answer carried no anger, only urgency. "Right now, we need to protect the systems that are still recoverable." Hale nodded immediately. "Tell us what you need." Jordan placed his laptop on the nearest conference table and connected it to an isolated engineering monitor that remained physically disconnected from the compromised network. The screen came to life with locally stored analysis files that he had saved before losing access. Complex diagrams filled the display, showing layers of authentication paths, certificate chains, and hidden synchronization loops that had remained invisible to every automated monitoring platform inside the building. Engineers gathered around in complete silence. No one interrupted. No one doubted a single word. Jordan pointed toward a branching diagram highlighted in amber. The malicious code never attacked our servers directly. It convinced every trusted system to verify a false identity. Once that happened, the network began protecting the malware instead of rejecting it. One senior architect slowly removed his glasses and stared at the diagram. "That is why every security check reported healthy systems." Jordan nodded. "Exactly. The protection itself became the blind spot." Deputy Director Stephen Collins quietly stepped closer. His confident posture from earlier that morning had completely disappeared. "Can we remove the infected certificates?" Jordan answered honestly. "Not immediately. If we delete them now, thousands of connected systems will lose authentication at the same time. We have to rebuild trust before we disconnect it." Collins lowered his eyes. "I should have listened." Jordan looked at him calmly. "What matters now is what we do next." The words settled over the room with surprising weight. Several engineers exchanged silent glances because they understood how easily Jordan could have reminded everyone of their mistakes. Instead, he had chosen to move forward without assigning blame. General Hale turned toward the assembled specialists. "Everyone follows Mr. Brooks's technical direction from this point forward." There was not a single objection. Jordan quickly assigned responsibilities with the quiet confidence of someone focused entirely on solving a problem rather than proving himself right. "Lisa, isolate every offline backup that is never synchronized today." "Daniel, verify physical server integrity instead of software reports." "Colonel Benson, I need every external gateway disconnected manually, one location at a time. Please do not use automated controls." Each person acknowledged the instructions immediately. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Panic gave way to purpose. Instead of chasing dozens of failing alerts, the team began rebuilding the network one verified connection at a time. Jordan watched the isolated engineering monitor as fresh calculations appeared across the screen. The countdown he had feared was still moving, but more slowly than before. They had created a narrow window of opportunity. Outside the reinforced windows, bright morning sunlight continued pouring across the Pentagon courtyard, illuminating the marble walls with a calm that seemed almost impossible compared to the tension inside. Jordan noticed the warm reflection stretching across the polished conference table and remembered his mother telling him years earlier that sunlight always revealed what darkness tried to hide. He took one slow breath before looking back at the engineers surrounding him. Every person in the room, regardless of rank or title, was now working together toward the same goal. The laughter was gone. The assumptions were gone. Only quiet determination remained. General Hale watched Jordan for a brief moment before speaking softly enough that only the people nearest could hear. "Sometimes experience teaches us how to lead," he said. "Sometimes humility teaches us who we should have followed." Jordan offered only a small nod before turning back to the monitor. The first isolated recovery indicator slowly changed from gray to green, and for the first time since the crisis began, a single point of light returned to the dark operations center. The small green recovery indicator remained steady for 3 full seconds before a second one illuminated beside it, then a third. No one in the operations center celebrated because everyone understood how fragile the progress still was. Jordan Brooks watched the isolated engineering monitor with complete concentration, tracing the rebuilding chain one trusted connection at a time. Every restored authentication path created another opportunity to reclaim a piece of the network without allowing the hidden malware to regain control. The room had settled into an almost perfect rhythm. Engineers spoke only when necessary. Keyboards clicked with measured precision. Printed diagrams covered the conference table because nobody was willing to trust compromised digital documentation. General Richard Hale stood quietly near the rear of the room, observing something he had not witnessed in many years. Rank no longer directed the work. Expertise did. Jordan pointed toward a network map projected onto the isolated display. The next synchronization request will arrive in less than 2 minutes. If we redirect the trust validation through the clean offline certificates before that cycle begins, the malicious process will lose its authority to impersonate legitimate services. Lisa nodded immediately. The backup certificate vault is ready. Daniel looked up from another workstation. Physical integrity checks are complete. None of the offline storage systems were affected. Colonel Mark Benson stepped away from a secure maintenance panel. The external gateways have been disconnected manually exactly as instructed. Jordan allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Good. Now we rebuild the trust chain from the outside in instead of from the center out. That is what the malware expects us to do. Several senior architects exchanged impressed looks. One quietly whispered to another, "That is brilliant." Jordan heard the comment, but never acknowledged it. His attention remained fixed on the calculations moving across his screen. The countdown reached the next synchronization window. Everyone in the room instinctively held their breath. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the isolated recovery monitor displayed a single message in bright green letters. Trust verification accepted. Almost immediately, another dark display inside the operations center flickered to life. The secure communications dashboard reappeared. Moments later, a second wall display began loading operational data. One by one, additional systems returned. Not all at once, but in carefully controlled stages, exactly as Jordan had predicted. The atmosphere inside the room changed completely. The tension that had weighed on every shoulder slowly gave way to cautious hope. An engineer who had spent nearly 30 years protecting government networks looked toward Jordan with genuine admiration. "I have never seen anyone recover a compromised trust architecture like this." Jordan smiled politely without looking away from the monitor. "Neither have I. That is why we had to create a different path instead of repeating the old one." Deputy Director Stephen Collins stood motionless beside the conference table. Earlier that morning, he had questioned Jordan's judgment, dismissed his evidence, and personally removed his access badge. Now he watched the same young analyst calmly restore systems that entire departments had failed to recover. Collins finally spoke, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "Mr. Brooks." Jordan looked up. "Yes, sir?" Collins hesitated before continuing. "I judged you before I listened to you. That mistake belongs to me." The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different. It carried humility instead of doubt. Jordan answered with the same calm sincerity that had guided him throughout the morning. "We all make decisions with the information we believe is correct. What matters is whether we are willing to recognize new truth when we see it." General Hale slowly nodded. "That lesson is worth remembering." As another row of operational displays returned to normal, scattered green status indicators spread across the massive wall like the first lights appearing across a city after sunrise. The emergency warning tones gradually disappeared until only the familiar background hum of healthy systems remained. Engineers looked toward one another with exhausted smiles that needed no words. They knew the crisis was ending not because of luck, but because one quiet voice had refused to stay silent when everyone else believed the danger was impossible. Jordan leaned back for the first time since returning to the operations center and looked across the room. The same people who had overlooked him only an hour earlier were no longer seeing a young contractor standing beside a laptop. They were seeing the person whose integrity, patience, and knowledge had guided all of them safely through the moment they had never believed could happen. The final restoration sequence, completed with a soft confirmation tone that echoed through the operations center like the first note of a familiar song, returning after an unexpected silence. One by one, every remaining display refreshed with current operational data. Secure communications resumed across isolated channels, and rows of green status indicators slowly replaced the emergency warnings that had dominated the room only minutes earlier. No one applauded. The relief was too deep for celebration. Instead, dozens of experienced professionals simply stood still, watching the systems they had spent years protecting return to life, because one young analyst had refused to abandon the truth, even after being dismissed. Jordan Brooks quietly closed the final recovery script on his laptop and carefully reviewed every verification report before speaking. The immediate threat has been contained. I recommend keeping the trust architecture in restricted mode for the next 48 hours while every certificate is independently validated. Several senior engineers immediately began writing down his recommendations. General Richard Hale looked around the room before addressing everyone present. Those recommendations will become official procedure effective immediately. His voice carried the same authority it always had, but now it was guided by something different. Respect had replaced certainty. Deputy Director Stephen Collins stepped forward slowly, his shoulders noticeably lower than they had been at the beginning of the morning. He held Jordan's disabled identification badge in both hands. The plastic card no longer represented authority. It represented a decision that had nearly cost everyone far more than anyone had imagined. Collins stopped directly in front of Jordan and took a slow breath. "Mr. Brooks, there are moments in a career that define a person forever. Unfortunately, I believe this morning will define mine." Jordan remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I assumed your age meant inexperience. I allowed first impressions to replace careful judgment. I dismissed your evidence before I examined it, and I asked you to leave instead of asking you one more question. I cannot change that decision, but I can acknowledge it honestly." The room became completely still. Every engineer, officer, and administrator listened without interruption. Collins carefully extended the identification badge toward Jordan. "If you are willing, I would like to return this personally." Jordan accepted the badge with a gentle smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "Thank you, sir." Collins looked surprised by the simplicity of the response. "That is all you have to say?" Jordan glanced briefly around the room before answering. "We all came here to protect people we will probably never meet. If we spend our time protecting our pride instead, we lose sight of why we accepted that responsibility." The words settled over everyone with quiet force. General Hale slowly nodded before speaking. "Mr. Brooks, today you protected this organization from a technical failure, but you also reminded us that leadership begins with listening. That lesson may prove even more valuable." Lisa smiled warmly from across the conference table. Daniel quietly shook Jordan's hand. Colonel Mark Benson stepped forward and said, "I have served for nearly 3 decades. I hope I never forget what happened here today." Jordan thanked each of them with the same humility he had shown from the beginning. He never mentioned the laughter that greeted him earlier. He never reminded anyone that his warning had been ignored. He simply answered questions, explained the remaining recovery procedures, and patiently walked every engineering team through the long-term verification plan so that everyone understood not only what to do, but why it mattered. Outside the reinforced windows, the bright morning sunlight continued shining across the Pentagon courtyard, exactly as it had before the crisis began. Employees once again crossed the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, unaware of how close the morning had come to unfolding very differently. Inside, however, something had permanently changed. Trust was no longer measured only by rank, years of service, or impressive titles. It had been earned through quiet courage, careful preparation, and the willingness to speak uncomfortable truth with respect instead of arrogance. As Jordan gathered his laptop and prepared to leave the operations center, General Hale watched him for a long moment before saying softly enough that only those nearby could hear, "Thank you for choosing to come back after we gave you every reason not to." Jordan paused at the doorway, looked back with a calm expression, and answered, "The mission was always bigger than the misunderstanding." Those simple words remained in the room long after he walked into the quiet hallway, leaving behind restored systems, humbled leaders, and a team that would never again underestimate the value of listening before judging. 1 week later, the Pentagon looked exactly the way it always had from the outside. Morning sunlight reflected across its pale stone walls. Employees crossed the wide walkways carrying coffee and briefcases, and the steady rhythm of government service continued as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Yet for the people who had stood inside the operations center that morning, every familiar hallway carried the quiet memory of a lesson none of them would ever forget. Jordan Brooks arrived just before sunrise, as he always preferred, wearing the same charcoal sweater, carrying the same well-worn laptop bag, and offering the same friendly smile to the security officers stationed at the entrance. This time, however, the greeting was different. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," one officer said with genuine warmth as he opened the security gate. "Good morning," Jordan replied with the same humility he had always shown, never expecting special treatment, simply because others now recognized what he could do. Inside the building, a small ceremony had been arranged in one of the conference rooms overlooking the central courtyard. There were no television cameras, no reporters, and no dramatic speeches prepared for public attention. General Richard Hale had requested that the gathering remain private because he believed some moments deserved reflection more than publicity. Senior engineers, military officers, cybersecurity specialists, and administrative staff quietly filled the room. When Jordan entered, the conversation stopped, not because people were uncomfortable, but because every person present stood to welcome him. General Hale stepped forward carrying a small presentation case. "Mr. Brooks," he began, "during my career I have presented many awards for excellence, leadership, and service. Today I believe we recognize something even more important. You demonstrated integrity when your warning was ignored. You demonstrated professionalism after being dismissed. Most importantly, you demonstrated character when you chose to return without resentment and help the very people who had failed to listen." He opened the case and removed a permanent government identification badge. "Effective today, your temporary contract has been replaced with a permanent appointment as Senior Cybersecurity Advisor." The room filled with warm applause that lasted several seconds before gradually fading into respectful silence. Jordan accepted the badge with both hands and looked around at the familiar faces. "Thank you," he said softly. "I am honored by your confidence, but I hope we all remember that this recognition belongs to everyone who was willing to learn, adapt, and work together. Technology changes every day. Humility has to grow with it." Deputy Director Stephen Collins stepped forward once more. "I have spent the past week reviewing every decision made that morning," he admitted. "I discovered something uncomfortable. The greatest vulnerability in our system was never the software. It was the assumption that experience alone guaranteed we could not be wrong." Jordan smiled gently. "The strongest teams are not the ones that never make mistakes. They are the ones that recognize truth quickly enough to correct them." Several people nodded quietly because they knew those words reached far beyond cybersecurity. As the meeting concluded, employees slowly returned to their offices while Jordan walked alone through the long marble corridor where he had once been escorted toward the exit. The polished floor reflected the morning light streaming through tall windows, and for a brief moment he stopped beside the glass overlooking the courtyard. Outside, a young intern hurried across the sidewalk carrying a laptop almost identical to the one Jordan had owned when he first arrived. The sight made him smile. Everyone begins somewhere, he thought. The opportunity to be heard should never depend on age, appearance, or first impressions. He clipped his new identification badge onto the same place on his sweater where the old one had hung before it was taken away, then continued walking without looking back. Behind him, conversations resumed, keyboards clicked, and the quiet rhythm of ordinary work returned once again. Ahead of him, sunlight stretched across the hallway in a long golden reflection, and Jordan walked through it with the same calm confidence that had guided him from the beginning, knowing that true strength had never come from proving others wrong. It had come from choosing wisdom over pride, kindness over bitterness, and service over recognition, leaving behind not only a safer system, but a room full of people who had finally learned that the quietest voice is sometimes the one worth hearing first.